Right, the story of David Livingstone, often closely associated with his discovery of the Victoria Falls in 1855. Now, I have to use those words discover and explore in the loosest sense of the term. You see, there's archaeological evidence that people have lived on the banks of this river for 40,000 years. They did not need a Scotsman to come across the ocean to tell them that, in fact, they had a very big waterfall in the area. So if David Livingstone and other great European explorers did not, in fact, discover anything, did they? Yeah? It was always found by someone else before them. Then what am I doing here chatting to you this evening? Why is our main road into town still called Livingstone Way? Zambia's third largest city is still called Livingston. Why are we taught about this man in our schools? Well, David Livingstone is in our history books because of the resultant changes that occurred after his 3 epic journeys through this continent. These journeys would launch the careers of other great explorers, some perhaps you've heard of. Speke, Stanley, Burton, Baker, Grant, Cameron, many, many others. These guys were like the Apollo astronauts of our time. They really were going into a very dangerous unknown. And if that is the case, then David Livingstone is the Neil Armstrong of our group. I had a speaker once say the Louis Armstrong. Perhaps not. But perhaps we may cover a bit of Louis's ancestry, though, here this evening. Now, these guys would spend 30 years crisscrossing this continent, and they would produce something very important for the outside world. What would that be? Maps. Thank you, sir. Now, these maps would then be used in a very important conference, ending in what they called the Berlin Agreement, where the 7 great powers of Europe just sat around a boardroom table, similar to this, and carved up amongst themselves the political boundaries of Africa. Now, the decisions made at that conference were momentous. They have affected the lives of people in Africa now for over 150 years, and will continue to affect their lives for centuries to come. You see, it was a grave, grave error. Do you want this moved away, sir?
No.
A grave, grave error to carve up an entire continent on geographical boundaries rather than, say, cultural or ethnic boundaries. Things happened rather swiftly after these guys' visits to Africa. We've all seen our Victoria Falls Bridge, have we not? Yes, spanning the Batoka Gorge. When that bridge was built, it was the world's highest and longest span. It was a British engineering feat, and it was built within only 50 years of Livingstone's visit to Victoria Falls. Folks, that's pretty extraordinary stuff. How many of you from America? Yeah? That's pretty much your Golden Gate Bridge being built within 50 years of your Lewis and Clark traversing America. No. Things just never happened that quickly. But right here, this is the hallowed ground of African exploration, and things moved on very, very rapidly. We have to still wonder, though, what on earth is this white guy doing standing awestruck at the edge of that magnificent waterfall? Well, to tell you that part, let's begin right at the beginning. David Livingstone was born in 1813 in a little town called Blantyre, that is a suburb of Glasgow in Scotland. And he was born into a very poor working class family. I'm sure I do not need to remind you folks of the conditions that these children grew up in post-industrial Britain. They were sent to work at a very young age. And this is young David's fate. By the age of 10, folks, 10 years old, this child is sent to work at the local cotton factory, the cotton mill in town. Alongside his brothers and sisters, is working very hard in order to just survive. They are working 12, 14-hour shifts a day, 6 days a week. Yeah, our kids think they have it tough nowadays, yeah? 6 days a week. On Sunday, Neil, their father, would take his family off to church being a religious man, but he has an ulterior motive. You see, the Church of Scotland had now become very concerned about the illiteracy rate that was developing amongst the young. These kids were growing up into adulthood. They couldn't read the letter. So what they would do is employ a teacher to come into church and teach these kids for 6 hours every Sunday after church. Some of you might be familiar with the expression Sunday school. You remember that? Yeah? That's exactly what it was. And this is where young David would get most of his formal education. Now, I would love to tell you that he was this most exceptional extraordinary student, but I would be wrong. You see, the writings at the time tell us that young David was average, mediocre at best. But what we are told by every adult that knew this child was that he was blessed with this formidable determination. And it is that determination that just continues to show itself in our story this evening. First story of determination comes after his very first week at work. He takes his first paycheck, bypasses the local bookstore, and he makes a purchase of several books that would interest him. Returns home, pays the balance of the money over to his mother, to help pay for home expenses, and that evening is found in one room, 7 children, 2 adults, under lamplight, and this child is studying off his own bat. Imagine the foreman's surprise. Comes Monday morning, amidst this chaos and bedlam of this working factory, this child has a book propped up on his spinning jenny, and he is teaching himself to read Latin. Yeah? An unusual thing for any child to be doing anyway. But this unusual dedication to his studies would reward him in spectacular fashion. By the age of 19, he is now qualified to be enrolled into Anderson College. Now, Anderson College is the modern medical faculty for the University of Glasgow. By the age of 28, so 9 years later, David is qualified as a fully fledged medical doctor. He has been trained as an overseas Christian missionary. You see, he believes that missionary and doctor, would go well together. In fact, to save his life on many, many occasions. He's been recruited by the London Missionary Society, dispatched to our shores, arriving into Cape Town, that direction, in 1841. And thereby begins his very first short journey, a journey of only 500 miles. But if I may remind you all, on foot. No cars, trains, planes, buses. Consider this, no cell phones, GPS, or even Facebook, How could he possibly have survived? But survive he does. He makes this journey to meet a man that has been his mentor, a man that has inspired him with the stories on Africa. That man's name? Robert Moffat. Moffat runs his own mission station 500 miles north of Cape Town in a little place called Kuruman. At Kuruman, more importantly perhaps, David meets Robert's eldest daughter, Mary. They are to fall in love, get married, to make their own missionary statement on the world and move away from mother-in-law. We read about a few rifts occurring in the family. They decide to open up their own mission station, a further 300 miles north, on the outskirts of the Kalahari Desert, modern-day Botswana, at a place called Mapotsa. Now, David and Mary spend the next 10 years ministering the Christian word to the Makatla people at Mapotsa. Now, it pains me to tell you that in those 10 long years between David and Mary, they could not account for one single Christian convert in 10 years. Would you still employ the man? Huh? Right, now you may assume that they were just poor missionaries or had a poor dedication to their work, but in fact there were several factors working against them. The first one was the Makatla people were semi-nomadic in their nature. They were the Bushmen. They weren't there long enough to really receive the full gospel. Secondly, and more importantly perhaps, David and Mary are ministering a very, very conservative type of Christianity. Scottish Presbyterian at that time was one of the most conservative about, to a tribe whose fundamental culture was to have as many, can we guess? Wives as possible. Thank you, sir. Now, back in the States, you'd probably call it a tough sell, yeah? Well, a tough sell it most certainly was. But in this 10-year period, David, and sometimes with Mary, had made a few journeys. And on one of those journeys, they'd crossed the Kalahari Desert, and they'd arrived at a place only 70 miles upstream from where we sit this evening, at a place called Linyanti. Have you guys done the Chobe yet? Tomorrow. The Chobe tomorrow. So in that area, spare them a thought. Now at Linyanti, they meet this very friendly and welcoming tribe called the Makalolo people. Makalolo, where's Blessing? I think we'll have a test afterwards, yeah? Fail that test, you're staying behind here with me, all right? You want to see how many of you lot I have at home? Right. The Makalolo people, kind, friendly, welcoming, and very receptive to the word of God. But more importantly, there are 6,000 of these people living, farming, fishing, working on the banks of this river in permanent situ. Now, when you consider his track record of, what was it now? 0, they decide to move their mission station to Linyanti. It makes sense. They have a captive audience in situ going nowhere. But he has a problem. The only way he knows how to get to Linyanti is by crossing this Kalahari Desert. That is Africa's second largest desert and can only be done in a 3-month window during the rains, when there's enough water to drink, enough animals for the pot. For the remaining 9 months of the year, they would be completely cut off from the rest of the world. No mail, no resupplies, no nothing. That just will not do. So he needs to find another way to enter into Linyanti. Let's say we travel up this river, near to the west coast of Africa, nearer to Britain, or we go downstream to the east coast of Africa, we go around the Horn and back to Britain. So what he decides to do, he takes Mary and the children down to Cape Town. He puts them on a ship destined for Southampton in England. You see, both David and Mary are under no illusions of the perils, the dangers of raising a young family here in Africa. Folks, this is pretty interesting stuff. Kids, take note. The life expectancy of a European explorer at that time, and I do not mean a Robert Moffat in his hut going nowhere, a man that was on the move, 6 months. 6 months, and every single European explorer has now either died or left this continent a very, very sick man. David and Mary have done rather well with their little bit of missionary work and travels here and there. They have 4 children under the age of 5. So I have a mother of 4 come up to me after one of my talks. She quietly whispers in my ear, she says, "You know what, son? I don't think that Mary was too unhappy to be separated from David for a short while at least." Poor girl. Right, levity aside, this decision to send Mary and the children back to England proved to be a disastrous one. You see, Mary found herself completely unprepared for the weather, the culture of doomy, gloomy Britain. She'd grown up in the wilds and beauty of this place. She'd made ends meet as a missionary's daughter and now as a missionary's wife. But furthermore, there'd been some serious miscommunication with David's benefactors back home, and Mary and the children find themselves arriving into England completely broke, penniless. For the next 4 years, unbeknown to David back in Africa, Mary and the children are passed from distant family friend to distant family relative, eventually finding her desperate family on the steps of a poorhouse. It does not then surprise us to read that Mary began her lifelong struggle with alcoholism, so she began to drink. Back in Africa now, David is not faring that much better. Now, he's made a purchase of several maps. Now, these maps were Portuguese in descent, and they're for where he intended to go. Let me just quickly show you what one of those maps would typically look like at the time. We can study the detail later. Got it? Right, of course they had maps, but they were sketchy at best, and these maps would prove to be tragically inaccurate. He takes them, he crosses the Kalahari Desert, he arrives at Linyanti, he's given 28 volunteer Makalolo porters, and he has decided to strike out west. You see, it makes sense. According to the maps he's holding, it's only a mere 300 miles to the source of the Zambezi, and a further mere 120 miles across land to the coastal portal town of Luanda, that is modern-day Angola. Off he goes. He arrives at the source of the Zambezi. It was not 300 miles, it was over 500 miles. And he arrives there a very, very sick man. David Livingston has now contracted malaria 21 times on a 500-mile leg alone. He's begun to run out of essential supplies. The main one being, I think you guys pronounce it quinine. We say quinine here. The only known cure and preventative for malaria at the time. He takes some readings with a sextant. He is horrified to discover he doesn't have a mere 120 miles still to go. This man has over 450 miles over some of Africa's roughest walking terrain. Certainly no choice, he cannot go back. Off he goes. 200 miles out of Luanda, David Livingston slips into a coma. This will be not the last time, folks, that his porters would construct a litter, a stretcher. They would carry this man the final 200 miles where they hand his barely alive body over to the British consulate for him to recover. After about 3.5 months, David Livingston has recuperated, but far from being happy that he has survived, this man is kicking himself. What he's come to realize is that where he was at Linyanti is almost exactly 1,000 miles to the west coast and 1,000 miles down to the east coast. Had he got onto some kind of boat, raft, floating vessel of sorts, untethered himself, and just floated gently all the way down to the Indian Ocean, surely that would have been a heck of a lot easier than what he has just done. He does what any determined Scottish explorer would do, of course. Gets up, resupplies, and marches straight back into Africa. He has not yet left this continent. He arrives at the source of the Zambezi, and now he is going to produce something for the world. He is going to map this river from its source all the way down to the sea. That is his intention. Off he goes. He arrives at Linyanti. He's given fresh porters and supplies, a great reunion with his friends, and he continues downstream. Now, he notices as he's wandering down the banks of the river, remember folks, he's not on a boat, he is walking this river again. He notices that it widens and deepens beautifully in places. Have you done a cruise yet on the river? Yeah? Okay, that area, if you do. He notices this. We all know about the Mississippi at this stage. Yeah, we all know about these massive big paddle steamers that are just chugging their way up and down this mighty river. Why can't he do the same? Why can't he put paddle steamers at the mouth of the Zambezi River, travel up this great river? He would cover 2/3 of Africa, and he would set up mission stations, trading posts, all along its banks. Folks, this was not going to be any river highway. This was going to be his, God's highway. But then we haven't yet come across the Victoria Falls. Have we done the falls yet? Have you done it? Next. Right. Spare him a thought. Right. He wakes up one morning at first light, something he does every day of his life, and he gazes downstream. He's about 4 miles upstream, pretty much where the jetties are there, blessing, where we all get on the boats, on the Zambian side. And he notices downstream this huge plume of what he perceives to be smoke rising in the distance. But it's accompanied by this continuous, low, roaring, droning sound. He questions his porters, his interpreters about it. They have no idea. Fortunately, he rounds a bend on the banks of the river, and he comes across a group of local tokalela fishermen, and they are fishing out of their makoro. How many of you are familiar with the word makoro? Yeah? It is a dugout canoe from a trunk of a tree. Yeah, you see them in Botswana? Yeah? Right, not the most stable of vessels, which you'll find out in a moment. He beckons them, they come across, and they tell him that it is in fact not smoke, is it? But spray, emanating from a very large waterfall below, known locally as, have we all done our homework? Have we? The Mosi Owatunya, which translated literally means the smoke that thunders, and we love that expression for our waterfall. They do a very kind and special thing. They invite him onto their makoro to take him down, to take a closer look. Now his journals tell us that he sits white-knuckled at the base of this makoro, terrified. About a mile upstream, the river begins to hasten. They begin to run some pretty substantial rapids with their punt. The sound of the waterfall becomes so loud that he cannot hear himself or others speak, and his clothing become drenched in the spray. This man fears for his life. But these guys, of course, have done this for centuries, and they carefully beach the canoe up against an island, now known as, anyone? Livingston Island. You're going to see it a bit later. And his journals tell us that he shakily disembarks, makes the way to the edge, gingerly gets down on one knee, takes off his explorer's cap, and he gazes down into this abyss. This man is awestruck. It is the most beautiful sight he has ever seen in his entire life. That night he writes some beautiful poetry in his journals. Things like, sight so lovely must have been gazed upon by angels in their flight. And he names it after his great queen, Victoria. Some kudos to him, I'm sure. He spends 2.5 weeks at the waterfall and falls in love with the place. And hopefully some of you will too. He takes some very accurate readings, literally by tying twine around a bullet, which he drops over the edge at several spots. Folks, we have double and treble checked these figures, and we still use them to this very day, unchanged. But he needs to get on. Sure, he's come across a little glitch in his plan. His boat will certainly go no further down or up past this obstacle. But how far forward thinking is this man? He now writes in his journals that perhaps one day paddle steamers will still enter from the mouth of the Zambezi, travel up this great river, and bring tourists to one day see this magnificent sight. Folks, within 50 years, the 2,000-mile railway line from Cape Town had arrived. The grand old lady, the Victoria Falls Hotel, had been completed, and that bridge had been completed, bringing the very first tourists to see Victoria Falls. Extraordinary. Right, he needs to get on. I digress. 500 miles down the river, he is again a very, very sick man. And he comes across this little village called Sikuru's village. Now this is where I'm going to ask you to mind my words, okay? Or the younger of us, watch my lips. Kind Chief Sikuru, kind being the operative word here, gives David a place to rest. After about 2.5 weeks, David Livingston feels strong enough in himself to continue his journey. But this kind man, kind Chief Sekuru, takes pity on the perceived ill health of David Livingstone and just decides to show him a shortcut. Yeah, it only cuts off 60 miles of some of the very roughest walking terrain in Africa. I know it well. I can assure you it is. We have to wonder now, why on earth would this man take a shortcut of 1 single mile if he is mapping this river, source to sea? Why would he do such a thing? We now understand by reading his journals that this man is suffering so poorly from illness and disease. He has typhoid, black water fever, malaria. He is hallucinating, and he is making the strangest of decisions, we can tell by reading his journals. So he's unaware of the shortcut. Off he goes, meets the river, and continues downstream. I love this part. Remember, folks, this is 1856, right? He writes in his journals, he doesn't elaborate, he writes, "I hailed a passing ship." You all okay with that? I mean, how the heck do you hail a passing ship in 1856? I suggest you settle down on the beach, yeah? You write London in the sand in big letters, and then lie back for 3 or 4 years. Love it, love it, love it. But he does catch a passing ship via Mauritius, and he arrives back to London. And he arrives to a hero's welcome. The press and the public are having a field day with this man's exploits. Let me just go through them for a very quick moment. He is the first man, forget European, but he is the first man to walk from the west coast of Africa right across this continent to the east coast. Now, in a straight line, that is only 2,000 miles. This man has already walked an extraordinary 6,500 miles. By the time David Livingstone dies, he would have walked, anyone? 28,000 miles. That is further than circumnavigating the globe. And no man has since. He has outstripped, of course, all life expectancy rates. We can shove that 6 months aside. This man has been in Africa now for over 14 years. And he has discovered the most magnificent waterfall in creation. The press and the public just love this man. He writes a book, the sales of which would make him a moderately wealthy and influential man. It is that influence, therefore, he uses on the British government to back his wildly optimistic plans of putting a paddle steamer at the mouth of the Zambezi and travel all the way up to the Victoria Falls. Folks, within only 2 years. I doubt you could do this nowadays in 2 years. He is back on a ship with a hand-picked crew. He has men of faith. Even a bishop is on board. He's got friends and a brother. He has artisans to help teach the tribe skills. He has his engineers, and he has who? Anyone? Mary. Mary now, who refuses to be separated from her husband again. They round the Horn of Africa, they enter in at the mouth of the Zambezi, and thereby begins the arduous task of bolting and riveting together this 40-foot metal paddle steamship they've just brought along. I love it. Excuse me. Now, they have christened this vessel the Ma Robert. In our language here, it's quite simple. Ma, mother of Robert. Robert was Mary and David's eldest son, so they have called it Mary. I think that's a lovely touch after all this woman has been through. But unfortunately, this vessel is fraught with problems right from the very beginning. You see, tested back home in England on a stagnant duck pond, yeah? In fair weather, I might add, she might have sufficed. Doing what? 11, 12 knots? But fighting against the current of this mighty Zambezi River, double that current at the mouth. She was completely underpowered. If she went straight, she went backwards. They had to tack, bank to bank, the entire journey up this river. The engineers on board, secretly behind David Livingstone's back, called this vessel the Asthmatic. It's what she sounded like as she coughed, wheezed, and spluttered up this river. Cough and splutter they did. They did remarkably well. They covered about 450 miles when that familiar roaring, droning sound came back to David Livingstone's ears on the deck of the Ma Robert. Now, if we are familiar with our geography at this stage, oh dear, we are still 500 miles from the Victoria Falls. So what on earth could this sound be? I ask you please to spare a thought for these gentlemen and Mary. For as they rounded the bend in this river, what stood before them in all its splendorous glory was the tallest gorge they had ever seen. twice the depth of our gorge beneath our bridge. With these massive waterfalls and rapids careering towards him, he steers the Mar Robert aside, he disembarks, he does a short 4-week reconnaissance of the area. But it doesn't take David Livingstone 5 minutes to realize that his boat will go no further up this river. What they come across was the Cabora Bassa rapids and gorge in Mozambique. Yeah, that's been dammed now for hydroelectricity to the region. But anyone, how did he miss it on the way down? Anyone? The shortcut. Yeah, that shortcut where the very kind Chief Sekuru, yeah, has now completely destroyed David Livingstone's reputation as a cartographer and as an explorer forever. Can you imagine how devastated this gentleman and Mary felt? But we did say somewhere, I believe in passing, that he was a determined man. He about turns, convinced he'll find another river then to service his dreams of crossing Africa. He'd noticed a large river entering as a tributary on his way up. He travels up this river. It is called the Shiri, or Shire River. He travels up this river, but it becomes too shallow for his paddle wheel. So he steers the Mar Robert aside, he disembarks, he walks upstream 400 miles, and he discovers Lake Nyasa, that is modern-day Lake Malawi. A most beautiful freshwater lake. If you ever get a chance to see it, you must. Back down to his little boat, desperate to find another river. But sickness and death are now beginning to take its tragic toll upon this little boat. These deaths lay heavily on his shoulders and on his conscience, but no death would cut him more deeply than that of his dear wife, Mary. She dies of fever in his arms and is buried on the banks of our Zambezi River near a little town called Tet, along with part of David's soul. But this man just keeps on going. Out now into the Indian Ocean. He's turned left. He's going north up the east coast, where he finds another large river entering the Indian Ocean. This river, folks, is called the Rovuma River. He travels up this river, but there's a stench approaching, this smell of rotten flesh. His paddle wheel then begins to get fouled up with something in the river. He steers the Mar Robert aside, he disembarks. Close investigation to the culprits of that fouling up of his paddle wheel, David Livingstone discovers human bodies. He does another short reconnaissance of the area. And David Livingstone, this great abolitionist, is absolutely appalled to discover that the slave trade, far from dying out in Africa, which the world believed it to be at the time, what these Arabs had merely done was shifted their business from the west coast of Africa, where there had been an embargo by the British Navy for over 30 years after the signing of the Wilberforce Act, shifted that business over to the unexplored east coast. And sure, it meant further to go. Sure, fewer survived. Who cared? They just charged more per living soul on arrival. That was their business. Off he goes, desperate to find another river. Well, the British government now realizes that after 5 years, this man will seem to stop at nothing. It seems to matter not who or how many die on his little boat. Clearly no river to traverse through Africa, and the spending of over £100,000 of British taxpayers' money. Mercifully, they pull the plug on the expedition and they recall it home. This time David Livingstone arrives back in London, a failed, saddened, and seemingly beaten man. He tries to tell the public, through the press, of the horrors of the slave trade that he has just witnessed on the latter part of his Zambezi expedition. The press and the public are no longer interested in a single thing that this man has to say on any matter whatsoever. He is forced to retire to his London apartment and lick his proverbial wounds. About a year later, though, he opens a London newspaper. On the front page of this newspaper are the failures of 2 other explorers. Their names, John Hanning Speke and Richard Francis Burton. The actor had to be named after him, for sure. Right, these 2 gentlemen, I apologize, because one was a gentleman, the other most certainly was not. These 2 men have been sent on an assignment by the Royal Geographic Society to find the source of the Great White Nile, something which has been under contention for thousands of years. In the middle of Africa, they decide to have this almighty row over who was in charge of the expedition, whose job was what, etc. They parted ways. Speke went on to discover Lake Victoria, Burton to discover Lake Tanganyika. They both arrived back in London at slightly different times, in fact only 8 days apart, claiming that their lake was the source of the Nile. Oh dear folks, we cannot have two sources. And this proves highly embarrassing for the boss at the time. His name, Roderick Murchison, the world's fastest flowing waterfall in Uganda, named after him. He is in great danger of losing public sponsorship, credibility, support. He needs to find someone very swiftly to resolve this issue. Now, despite his failures on the Zambezi, there really is only one someone. David Livingstone is still the authority on Africa. So tongue-in-cheek, they invite this man to lead this next expedition into Africa to find the source of the Nile. David Livingstone accepts this invitation, but he has a secret. Now, it's a rather dark secret when you consider his Christian upbringing, and is only revealed to us by reading his journal after his death. He is going to use this journey because he knows where it is going in relation to the slave trade, slap bang in the middle, East Central Africa, and he is going to use this journey to expose that trade to the British public and get it shut down once and for all. He may or may not look for the Nile. So he's using this journey to service his own desires. Folks, this journey takes 5 years. 5 long years before a single word of this man will leave Africa. He completely disappears, and the story is both tragic and fascinating. He rounds the Horn of Africa. He enters in at this little town called Bagamoyo, where after about 4 or 5 weeks on foot, he notices now this huge plume of, what is it with these plumes, do you think? Eh? Dust rising in the distance. Closer investigation to that dust reveals to David Livingstone his very first coffle. Any of you aware of that word coffle? Hopefully not. It is the olden day word belonging to the Arab slave trade caravans. These miles and miles long chains, human chains, walking the way to the east coast of Africa. Now he doesn't come across 1, 2, 3, 4, 20 of these. No. He comes across hundreds of them. He writes in his journals that he estimates at that time over 46,000 souls are being marched to the east coast of Africa. That is a human migration. He is very, very distressed by this. But he is not perhaps as distressed and terrified as his porters. Yeah? They don't want to be caught and traded as slaves, so they desert him. All but 3 desert him. And they leave David Livingstone very much alone in a very, very dangerous place. David Livingstone is under no illusions of the danger that he is in. He is forced to make a very ironic decision. Now I say decision because there is a choice here. He could go home. He chooses now to join his small band of 4 men and supplies to the larger Arab slave trade caravans and going in the direction that he wishes to go. Folks, this does not mean that he observes the slave trade. What? From a distance on every other couple of days, couple of weeks. No. This means he is completely and utterly immersed within that trade. Now there is a difference. There's a genocide happening on the doorsteps of his tent. He is powerless to do anything about it except, document it. He documents every single atrocity that he comes across because one day surely someone will be sent to find him. And to that someone, he can entrust his litany of horrors to be sent back to England and get this business shut down. He writes 44 letters to influential men back home, pleading with them to close this open sore. Who does he entrust his letters to? The Arab slave traders themselves, heading down to the coast. Now they know this man. He is a very, very famous white guy in Africa. They know what he's writing. They cannot read it, of course, but they know what he is writing. It is no secret that this man abhors the slave trade. So every single letter ends up on the nearest campfire at night. What is he going through? He's run out of paper within 2.5 years. He's writing on Arabic newspapers that come along, around the outsides, in between the lines, and on the reverse. Wonderful originals of these are in our Livingstone Museum across the river. What is he going through? 4 different missions are sent by the British government to find David Livingstone. Robert, his eldest son, is on one of these missions, and every single one of them returns home empty-handed, without a single word of this man. He has completely disappeared. Now, I would have thought that the most sensible solution for these Arabs would be to take the guy out. Let the hyena do the rest. But they know, if word of this man's murder, now word of Africa, as we know, is enormous. If word of this man's murder were to get back to that grand old lady Victoria across the ocean, the wrath of her navy and government would be now down onto the east coast, and that would be their business shut down. So they make an ironic decision. They choose to care for him. They feed him when he's hungry. They clothe him. They nurse him when he's ill. They save his life on many occasions, but what they also do is isolate him. They take him on these meaningless, meandering journeys through Africa, and they isolate this man from the entire world for 5 long years. What is he going through? He writes in his journals that packs of hyena and pride of lion just follow these coffles for hundreds of miles, feeding off those too infirm to make the journey, are untethered, still alive, thrown to the wayside and fed to the beasts. What's it doing to his faith in humanity? But more importantly, perhaps, to his faith in God. But this man does have faith. And one of the greatest testimonies to faith, in my opinion, is who would be the best man to find David Livingstone, yeah? Should it be a farmer, a carpenter, a fisherman, perhaps a metal worker? I think not. How about one of the world's finest journalists and publicists? That's what he needs, his word, to get home. Enter into our story Henry Morton Stanley and the words to that most famous greeting of all time. Stanley works for James Gordon Bennett. He owns the New York Herald, amongst many other newspapers around America. It's the world's biggest media tycoon at the time. And he knows that finding Livingston would mean big bucks for his newspaper chain. So he enlists this young, energetic, enthusiastic, fittest, finest journalist for this mission. Go and discover the discoverer, he says. And here is a blank checkbook for your mission. A very good reason why we do not give young people blank checkbooks. Coming up. Livingstone and Stanley. They were an unlikely pair, should we have ever met. Stanley was 29, Livingstone 59. Folks, 59 years old in one of the harshest environments on this planet, when life expectancy back in Europe was between 38 and 42. He is 59 years old. But they're not too different in their upbringing. You see, Stanley was born John Rowlands in Wales. He was born into a poorhouse. His mother was a prostitute. He never knew his father. By the age of 15, he'd broken out of the poorhouse. By the age of 17, he'd stowed away on a ship to America, where he changed his name and fought on both sides of your civil war. A wily character, this Stanley. But a great read. If you ever get a chance to read some of his work, you must. Resting one day on the banks of Lake Tanganyika in this little town called Ujiji. Don't you love that word? Ujiji. David Livingstone is resting because he knows if he doesn't rest, he would surely die. Resting one afternoon, he is rudely roused. I once said aroused, but I don't think it was picked up. By this procession approaching, there's a screaming and shouting and clapping of hands. He emerges from his tent. He stands there annoyed, this grumpy old man with a stick. Now you have to visualize the scene. We have 2 porters approaching. They're each carrying an enormous American flag, waving them frantically like this. Preceding them, we have a full 30-man marching band in the middle of Africa. How cool is that? Doesn't that sound like something Donald would do? Eh? Preceding them, we have over 200 porters carrying everything. We've got 4-poster beds, mattresses, copper bathing baths, sofas, dining room suites. We've got food, armory, trading goods, you name it. And of course that was the blank checkbook. I love it. I would have done exactly this. But with one step, this crowd is silenced and parted. And there steps forward Henry Morton Stanley, dressed immaculately in white. He steps forward, he doffs his cap, puts out his hand, and he says the words to the most famous greeting of all time. Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Now these 2 men become inseparable. For the next 9 months, they traverse that entire part of Africa, gathering more and more evidence against the slave trade. Stanley writes in his journal that he idolized Livingston as the father he never had. But after 9 months, this ambitious young man has surely seen and done enough. He needs to get home before he dies, of course. And he has the story. So he returns back to America via Europe. He puts on the front page of every single newspaper of every single civilized country of the world, one man's stand against slavery. And once again, David Livingstone would become a very famous and well-loved man. But he would never know this. You see, he has chosen to decline Stanley's invitation to return back to England with him, remain in Africa, because now he'll look for the Nile. At 60 years old. Extraordinary. The British public, upon reading Stanley's words on Livingston and the slave trade, are incandescent with rage. They storm Parliament. They force that Gladstone government at that time to put an end to slavery sooner than later. Folks, all because of one man's courage, another man's pen. Ended the slave trade just like that. Back in Africa now, David, with borrowed porters and supplies from Stanley, remember, safety in numbers, he has decided to travel north in pursuit of this little river called the Luapula River, which runs south to north, just like the Great White Nile. Unfortunately, he erroneously believes it to be part of its source. After 9 months, his journals tell us that it has rained incessantly for 5 long weeks, day in, night out. They cannot see the stars, they cannot take any readings. They find themselves lost in a treacherous place. That place is called the Bengweru Swamps of central Zambia. Enormous area of wetland. He writes in his journals that they are battling during the day, chest high, through these swamps, crocodiles, hippopotamus, water snakes, leeches. At night, they are huddled together for warmth on these windswept reedbed islands and for protection against the predators of the night, of which we know there are many. Not even David's body can withstand such treatment, and he collapses. He has begun to hemorrhage internally and ulcerate externally. And now for the last time, folks, his porters would construct another stretcher and just carry him through the swamp. Mercifully, of course, there is a break in the weather. He's able to take some readings and find their way out of the swamp. They arrive at this little village called Chitambo's village, where Chief Chitambo gives them a place to be rested. His porters construct a bed out of bulrushes, and they lay him down as carefully as they can. They then construct this makeshift hut around him and above him to protect him from the elements of the night. The next morning, his 2 main porters arrive at this tiny hut to receive their marching orders for the day. But they notice that lamplight still spills from this little hut and decide to leave him to rest for a little while longer. But after a time, and no sound, they put their heads around the doorway, and there they find their friend, leader, their master. He is kneeling at his bedside. His grey weathered head is in his hands in an act of prayer, and his journal lay beside him. They rush to rouse him, but he is already cold and stiff. Sometime all alone in the night, David Livingstone, doctor, missionary, explorer, humanitarian, and true African, had made his final journey. Now, folks, if that story of David Livingstone were ever to come to mind in the future, I ask you please to bring to mind this very quick, very important story of 2 of his porters. You see, I put it to you that no European explorer would have survived 4 weeks or 100 miles in this continent without their porters. They were an absolutely essential part of their very survival. Now, these 2 men have been with David now for over 17 years. I put it to you that no 2 men knew David better than these 2. They were his friends, his confidants, his lifesavers. Their names were Susi and Chuma. Susi and Chuma, and they deserve recognition. And their bronze statues stand on the Zambian side of Victoria Falls. But what stands on their shoulders now is what on earth to do with this man's body. But you see, here in Africa, in our culture here, it's no big deal. If you die and are buried away from your family or your home, that is a fate worse than death. Why? Because your soul will just wander eternally trying to find them. So what they're going to do is take his body, back down to the coast. So after 2 weeks of traditional mourning, they've cut his body open. They've already moved all his internal organs, heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, placed it in a hole that they've dug at the base of this enormous African hardwood tree called a mwanga tree, which still stands to this day in Chitambo's village. They've embalmed his body in salt and brandy. Yeah? They've folded it once, they've folded it over itself a second time, and they've wrapped it tightly in this muslin cloth. Now they've made it look like a pack of travelling goods. Now you may wonder why. You see, in those days, if a band of black men were found with the body of a white man, they were executed on the spot without trial, and they were accused of witchcraft, and they knew this danger. Thereby begins, folks, only the longest funeral march in the history of our planet. 1,500 miles, taking 9 months, costing the lives of another 8 men. And they never faltered once. They made it all the way down to Bagamoyo, where they handed this body over to a group of Jesuits who kindly arranged for its shipment all the way back to England, where after a few months of pomp and ceremony, as the English are so good at, are they not? Yeah? We've just seen the Jubilee and all, yeah? David Livingston is laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, in Explorer's Corner, in fact, quite near Charles Darwin and the likes. You've got to wonder what they're chatting about in the spirit world. Yeah? Fascinating stuff. I used to say I cannot wait, but I think I can wait a little bit longer. Yeah? Right, 2 years later, Susi and Chuma are offered a sponsored trip by the British government to come and see the resting place of their great friend, leader, and master. Okay, there's often an ulterior motive with the British government, is there not? Yeah? To fill in a few gaps on the biography being written at the time on David Livingston. Now, these two fellows who having been with David for 17 years, fluent in English, were surely the only two that could fill in all these very many gaps. Once these two poor fellows have recovered, can you imagine, from the awe and splendour of London, the lights, the coachworks, Westminster Abbey in itself. Once they'd recovered, one of the delegates asked them, why on earth would you undertake this arduous, life-threatening journey to bring just a body back to England? And what I'm about to tell you, folks, had no cultural reference to their beliefs. Why? They were two of David's true Christian converts. And what I'm about to tell you remains one of the nicest eulogies ever said of David Livingston, and remains on his epitaph to this very day in Westminster Abbey. And what they said was simply this: David Livingston was a great man and deserved to be buried amongst great men. If I have inspired you to spend a little time with the spirit of David Livingston, I have but one thing to say: do not go to Westminster Abbey, okay, folks? It ain't there. It ain't there. Rather, take yourself down to the east coast of Africa, to the island of Zanzibar. Yeah, walk those narrow, cobbled-worn streets of Stone Town. It is the capital and really the only known populated area of Zanzibar. At the end of one of these narrow, cobbled-worn streets, you'll find this most beautiful cathedral, built by the British government in David Livingston's name, the Livingston Cathedral, and in honour of the sacrifice of the slaves. It is built on the original slave trading court where they were auctioned. The altar remains unchanged to this very day, the original whipping post for those unruly slaves. Standing next to that altar stands a small carved ornate wooden cross, taken from the same tree that his heart is buried beneath in Chitambo's village. You see, Susi and Chuma had cut off this branch and carved this beautiful cross to be sent down with his body to the coast. Now make the journey on a Sunday, folks, with the faithful of Zanzibar, as they raise their eyes and voices to heaven and song, to those great old rousing British hymns, because it will be there that you are nearer to David Livingston's spirit than anywhere else in the world. You see, he may have been born in Scotland, buried in Westminster Abbey, but his heart remains here in Africa, amongst the people he loved so much. And I hope you've enjoyed his story.